this lecture will be a little bit about Maya urbanism, which has been an interest of mine for a long time, and I'm actually still involved in research on Maya urbanism. So this is really about that interest and what has sponsored it. The cover page, so to speak, that's in a city in Italy, and on the right, those are from Tokyo, green cities, which will come up. Okay, so Maya urbanism, because we really can learn from Maya urbanism today, particularly with the problems that we're seeing in soils and overgrazing, a lot of dependence on meat, on large farms with dairy cattle. This whole basis of Western, not just Western, but it's what we know the best, urbanism. So that's what I'm interested in. So first I would like to talk about what features of Maya society have implications for the character of its urbanism. So I'll just do architecture and food procurement, trade and exchange, social organization, and economy. And then I will introduce the idea of what we can learn from Maya urbanism. The concept of green cities, which I was just talking to Ian about, has always been an important concept in Britain. And there's very interesting history of groups of people who have wanted to encourage the development of green cities. And as I was saying to Ian, often agriculture in the city is a key part of the planning, but it always drops out. Like with places like Welland Garden City, and it's interesting as why that happens, why it's so difficult, but we'll think about it. So green cities, and what we call agro-urbanism, and density of people in cities that are green. And then one of my topics I've spent a lot of time on the neotropical environment and urbanism. And by neotropical we mean in the New World. The tropics of the New World, which part of the Maya area, and it extends to the Amazon basin, the neotropics. So architecture, what is the architecture like in Maya cities? Well, you've seen some of it already. It's mainly limestone. Not everywhere, because I did my PhD in an area that had no limestone, and they used granite. I couldn't believe it, but granite and slate. But in most places, they use limestone for civic structures, ceremonial structures, and even some private structures, some residences. And this is just an example of one of the higher structures at Lamanai, which is in Belize, where I've worked for the last, since 1998, but my husband started excavations there back in 1976. And this is the result of his work and reconstruction by the architect Stanley Lowton. So the Maya did a lot with limestone. So in addition to the higher pyramids, the civic and ceremonial buildings, there are also what are called palace compounds, which may, in some instances, are residences, but I expect that they were administrative complexes as well. We call them palaces, like this structure at Altanha, which is another site that my husband excavated in the late 60s and early 70s. And we call that a palace, but whether people actually lived in it or not, I'm a little skeptical. Climbing up and down those stairs every day could be fun, I suppose. But I expect it may have had storage facilities and other administrative functions. My husband believes that the structure A3 at the bottom was probably a residence, and it's possible, but I expect that these limestone-built masonry structures were part-time residences. Today, people in the tropics, any of you have lived in the tropics, and I lived in Belize for a while, you tend to use a lot of space. So there's some covered space, there's some space that's fenced in but not covered, there's spaces that's covered with no walls, there's spaces that are totally open, and they all form part of your household and all of these different functions. So to pick a building and say, they lived there, I think is probably unlikely, in that it was a more complex, had more complex functions. Now, most residents were probably of wood, As you can see here, a reconstruction, and this is a part of a modern compound. This is actually a reconstruction of a wood building. It's been covered. It's like wattle and daub. It's been covered with lime plaster. So most of the residences in the periphery, probably in some places in the city center, were of wood. And they're cool, wood and thatch. So what are the implications for urbanism? Well, but the fact that they have have platforms are good for archaeologists because we are able to detect city plans to some extent. The lower platforms when you're working in the jungle, well, can't really, in traditional archaeology, you can't find all of those platforms, but many of them are detectable, so we are able to get some idea of city plans. Of course, the wood architecture, though, is not preserved, so true density is difficult to detect in that sense. In terms of agriculture, and this is what I will get to in a few slides later, we think they had crop production in cities. They managed forests, as I mentioned before. They had what we think of as deer parks, orchards, and household gardens. So what did that mean for their kind of urbanism? Well, that's where we get the term agro-urbanism or garden cities, which is more of a mixture of the built and the green environment. What about trade and exchange? I've spent a lot of time on this in my research career because I've worked on the coast and I've excavated a lot of coastal sites. And there was a lot of circumpeninsular trade, a lot of exchange on local, regional, and global, well, interregional levels. Markets were important in exchange in getting many of the products to the various communities. And foot travel and waterborne travel were the main means of getting around. Now, what are the implications for urbanism? Well, the cities were built around walking, foot travel. We can also expect that there would be elevated paths so people could walk in the rainy season, roadways connecting cities, and that riverine and marine ports would be really critically important. There would be docks, loading bays, etc., and market spaces for markets. This is a map of the site of Calakmul, which was where this mural comes from. It's a mural that depicts people at a market, and you can see here that the space is where the market was probably held, and many of the plazas that for years people thought were just sort of empty spaces for some ritual were probably used for markets. And I have this P up there to remind me that today many of the archaeologists check plaza surfaces or in the areas of plaza for phosphorus. Where you have high concentrations of phosphorus, they think that might be the result of having market stalls, selling vegetables, things like that. And I wanted to mention, because if you read popular literature, or even actually my colleagues, they'll say, oh, the Maya, they didn't have the wheel, they didn't have horses, they didn't have beasts of burden, blah, 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 blah. You know what? If everybody walks, it's a commercial paradise. And what first gave me the idea to look at walking differently was, I do a lot of walking in London, but I was up at a was it a concert or something? Up in Camden, maybe a little north of that. And often I walk home late at night because I love being in the city and the sight and the sounds. And if you go along the street, there are people selling you drinks, they're selling you food, they're selling you sandwiches, because everybody's walking, right? And I thought, why are we thinking that the poor Maya, they didn't have horses, they didn't have the wheel? It's probably I think it was just the opposite. Where everybody walked, it must have been fantastic, people selling things to other people all the time. It must have been great. So I take the opposite attitude of Jared Diamond, if any of you have read his awful stuff, that cities built around foot traffic, they can be commercially very viable. And I just have a picture of me there, I think that was the 6th flat tire of the day. So the wheel is not always a great advantage, I can tell you. This fellow at the bottom has a tump line, and he's carrying goods on his back, and that is how the Maya carried goods around, was a tump line. Now, social organization, there were rulers, nobles, lower elites, middle classes, market administrators, people, potters, lithic specialists, farmers, hunters, fishers, many different levels of society. So if that is true, then we would expect in the city, in urbanism, that we would see manifestations of different kinds of houses, different levels of housing, and we do. We would expect functional spaces, which we do, but also the art and material culture would reflect these functions. And I just had some examples here from the Bonampak murals. Well, this is a particular ruler with people serving him. This is a warrior. Here we have this is from Calakmul, but it's an individual depicted on the mural with a tump line carrying a huge pot that presumably had goods in it. And this is a woman weaving. These are figurines that we won't really have good provenance. We know they're from an island called Taina off the coast of Mexico, but they're so beautiful. The site's been looted for years. So most of those figurines are in private collections, or if they are in museums, we don't know their exact context. Probably burials, but no more information than that. And as for the economy, it was a tribute and tax-based economy. Tribute is really a form of tax. The elites were entitled to the tribute and to the tax in the form of goods and services. So it's pretty much like today, where the wealthy people get a lot of the money, and the rest of us pay taxes. Of course, the wealthy have to pay taxes too, but they usually avoid it, don't they? So, but the interesting thing about Maya economy is that the wealth accumulation was aimed at the control of resources and not land per se. And this is a little bit hard, even for us to grasp. And I've done quite a bit of looking at sort of the modern situation. I learned that duchies, apparently, except for the Duchy of Luxembourg, are similar to the Maya, in which if you have a duchy, you don't actually own land, like the king who has rights to land in Cornwall, but doesn't actually own it, apparently. And so that is the way it worked among the Maya and among the Aztecs. And so you will find, for example, among the Aztecs, for whom we have more information, you'll have a city with a ruler getting taxes or tribute from a city that's 3 or 4 cities away. But he has nothing coming in from the cities that are nearest him. And that reflects the history of the relationships of the rulers. It may have been a war. May have been he married someone, which is the best way, married a woman from that city, and then they get taxes and tribute. So it explains a lot of kind of strange patterning we have with Maya cities. And I think that's what I say here. For the urbanism, we're going to expect the cities and their pattern in the landscape to reflect competition for resources rather than territorial acquisition, which, as you can imagine, makes it hard to reconstruct. Unless they have evidence in the stele in which they tell you that this king had a war and beat the king of another city, so we can assume that there was an exchange there. It's very difficult when it's not a territorial base to the wealth, or a direct territorial base. And I kind of made this point already, given the demands for products that are local and exotic, wide trade networks. Lots of storage structures in cities, although it's difficult to identify them specifically. And as I say, market spaces must have been numerous. And I just included, this is another rollout, as it's called, of a vase, one of the Maya vases. And you can see that people are bringing something here to rulers, probably a kind of tax. Some people think it's a gift. I don't know. I expect it's kind of tribute. And it's interesting because some of my colleagues have said these might be tamales, but I thought, and if any of you have ever eaten tamales, they're not going to last. They're not going to last an hour, I think, outside of the oven, never mind bringing it to a ruler. I think they're probably salt cakes, which were, salt was a very important trade item at the time. Okay, so cities and urbanism. Why stone cities and green cities? I've always been interested, well, no. Early on, I became interested in Maya cities. And I read this anthropologist, Conrad Arensberg, in 1980, he wrote a paper called Stone Cities and Green Cities. And he described that some cities in the world are heavily built and some have more green space. So the stone cities would be any of the cities where stone and mud brick or plaster dominates the cityscape, and green space is limited, and soils are covered extensively. And this limited to no soil connectivity, which is a term I'm going to explain a little bit more later, which is something that my colleagues and I are looking into, this concept of connecting to the soil. Within green cities, there's more of a focus on developing the green space as well as the built environment, particularly to produce some food, and soil connectivity is promoted. So I keep using the word city, and when I started out my career, the Maya and the Aztecs, they were not considered cities. The people in the old world would not consider these places cities. So what is a city? Well, I got this definition from a book by Ruth Whitehouse and John Wilkins, which is a wonderful book. It was put out in 1986, great pictures. And I bought up all of the ones on Amazon a couple of years ago and gave it to the library so my students could use it. But she has a wonderful definition there of what makes a city. Population density, the locus of craft production, it's a central place for all kinds of services and supplies, usually the center of political organization. And with that, you get elaborate architecture, market centers, storage, administrative buildings. So these apply to Maya cities, but the problem has been green space, in that too much green space and a place is not considered a city. And at least, as I say, this was true when I first began, and it's only slowly changing, I would say, in these last maybe 10 or 15 years. So why did people think that Maya cities do have too much green space? Well, for one thing, today, when you go to many of the sites, they're mostly jungle. So you have the areas that the archaeologists have excavated, and then they're surrounded by this lush environment. And that kind of, in your head, you're kind of thinking, wow, it's a lot of green. And there's too much green space. How could it be a city, with all that jungle? And even traditional maps, like those here, this is El Pilar. It's a site that actually is on both Belize and in Guatemala. My colleague Annabelle Ford has done a lot of work there on managed forest gardens. But you can see in this map, there are concentrated areas of built environment, but there's a lot of space between buildings. And this is Lamanai, where you can see the structures that are marked, but there are spaces between the buildings. So this open spaces have always given people the impression that there is too much green space. Now, reconstructions of the central precincts can show very dense built environment. Again, these are reconstructions, so we're not really sure, but it does look as if most of the central precincts didn't have much green space, although my husband tells me that at Alton Ha, he found areas in the plazas where there were these circular openings with finished plaster surfaces, and he wondered if that had been for trees or greenery. But at that time, I guess we didn't have the analytical capabilities. Well, I was in kindergarten, so I wasn't going to do it. But the field didn't have the analytical capabilities to analyze the soil and do macrobotanical analysis. But you can see in the upper right here, someone has reconstructed, I think that's Palenque, with a lot more vegetation. This is a more recent map of Tikal, and again, you have these really concentrated areas of the built environment, but a lot of what looks like open space, green space. So this is what have made my colleagues and others say that there's too much green space to be a true city. But now probably a lot of you have heard about lidar imagery, light detection and ranging imagery, which is being used in the Maya area, and it's a means by which structures can actually be seen in the jungle And these are examples of lidar technology where a laser beam is shot from an aircraft and they slowly build up a picture of what the areas that are covered by heavy forest, what they're like. And you can see what a difference it is. This is the excavated area of Caracol, and look at all these terraces that show up in the green space. And that is through the jungle canopy. So if you went there today, you would just see jungle. But with the LiDAR, you actually see all of these details. Same here. Takeshi Inamata is working in Tabasco, and this is also in forest. And they've discovered a very early site, so in the forest. So LiDAR has really changed the way people are looking at Maya cities. This is another LiDAR picture of Caracol, where Diane and Arlen Chase are excavating. And these are the excavated areas, but look at this. There's reservoirs, there's more buildings, there's more terraces, there's paths, there's roads here. Look, road there, road there, road there. And this has been detected through through the jungle. So what it shows is that the built environment is actually more extensive than we thought. But the green space looks to have been highly intensively manipulated. Now, were those terraces that you can see in these maps here you can see them, were they used for agriculture? Well, up till last week, I would have said, and in fact I had to change the label, that we don't know yet. But I emailed a friend, David Lentz, and he and his colleagues in 2022, well, its date just came out, but 2022, at a site called Yashno Ka, and they have discovered archaeobotanical evidence of domesticated plants in these terraces and in what we call bajos, low-lying places near ruins where we think they concentrated agriculture. So it looks like that we may be able to say that the terraces that we see in the LiDAR were used for agriculture. And there is also ethnohistoric and modern evidence of household gardens in cities, in towns, and villages. And there is documentary evidence at the time of the Conquest of orchards and different kinds of farming. And there's archaeological evidence of what are called raised or ditched fields near city centers, and we have those at Lamanai. And I just should mention, when I talk about the household gardens, when I worked for the government in Belize, I lived in the capital city called Belmopan, and everybody had lawns except for the Maya. You could always tell a Maya house, it was like a mini forest. And you go by the house, and it was just trees and plants and pepper plants, and so it was an entirely different idea of a garden, Oh, so I mentioned the raised fields. There was a farming system, wasn't swidden, wasn't orchards. And in central Mexico, they call them raised fields because they're built up of sediments from rivers or shallow lakes, as you can see here in Mexico. They're modern raised fields. We tend to call them drained field or ditched fields because usually the canals are dredged, and it helps to drain some of the water from the fields, and then materials built up on these fields. And this one in the lower right is an ancient ditched field in Blue Creek in Belize, where some of my colleagues, you can see their names there, have been working. And we also have ditched fields right at the edge of Lamanai, of the city of Lamanai. So there's mounting evidence that Maya cities were not only green cities, but garden cities. In other words, it wasn't just parks, they were growing things. So agriculture in the city and its environment. And we called this agro-urban landscape. But were they, as archaeologists, my colleagues claim, low-density cities? Because there's so much green, so much agriculture, there clearly could not have been as the kind of density that we have in London. Now, this is interesting. What do we mean by density? Well, I mentioned Teotihuacan at the beginning of the first lecture, and this is a city in central Mexico. It's not Maya. We don't actually know what the ethnic group of the people were. It's classic, meaning between about 150, 200 to about 600 when it kind of crashed. We don't even know what language they spoke, but it was a dense city. And as you can see, this is the map of part of the city center. And you just see these little rectangles here. which look like individual buildings, but in fact, these are those rectangles. And if you look within those walls, this is what you find. A whole grouping of masonry buildings. Some of them built around little patios and plazas here. Some of them were residences. Some of them were little ritual buildings. But that is our traditional idea of density, right? That kind of city. It was orthogonal, gridded. But were there cities with high density in the Maya area? And most people would say no, not like that. But in recent years, some evidence is appearing of some orthogonal patterns to Maya sites. And this is one in Guatemala, excavated by Tim Pugh, and I think you see it looks quite gridded. This is in Belize. One of my former graduate students with colleagues Christoph Helmke and Andy Bevan, and they were mapping in the Belize Valley, and they mapped a lot of mounds, or probably mostly residential structures, but a variety, and they used modeling systems to try to figure out what the pattern was on the landscape. And the one that worked the best was a gridded pattern. So there's some evidence that maybe there was indeed some orthogonal planning in the Maya area. However, I think you can see this is still not Teotihuacan. There's still a lot of green space, and that the gridding is organized differently. So is Maya agro-urbanism low density? So what makes a city urban isn't the city itself, but its relationship with its surroundings, with towns, with villages, with its hinterland. I mean, if you cut off Edinburgh, or if you cut off London, it would not survive, because the urban part is the city and everything around it. And the problem is that when my colleagues calculate density of Maya cities, they assume from the map that food needs are met by production in or around the city. We don't actually know that's true or not, but that's what the assumption is. And then they figure out density by it's based on some modern ethnography on how many people will be living in individual structures, and you multiply that times the space, so you get a density. Now, but the thing is, when it's compared to the density of London, it does appear to be low in terms of people per area. But when you calculate the density of London, we don't take into account where food comes from. So I've been interested in this idea for a long time, and in 2017, I hope Gwen doesn't mind me talking about this, but we should publish. For her BA dissertation, she looked at density in London as compared to the Maya area. But what she did was we sorted this out. It's crude, but she looked at her family and two households, and for a couple of months, 2 or 3 months, she tracked all the food they bought, and then on the food, for example, you get green beans and they're from Kenya, right? Or you buy broccoli and then that's from Cornwall, I don't know. And then she calculated how much land it would take to grow that many beans for that family. Okay, and this is what I say was a crude measure, because this really would take a lot more work. Well, in the end, it turned out that the densities, if you take into account the amount of land that's used for the food that people eat in the city, turns out the densities were not that different. And some, depending on the calculation, in some cases, London was even lower than Maya density. And I quoted from her dissertation, ancient Maya cities such as Tikal could in fact be considered more dense than modern London due to the reduced hinterlands and increased productivity within the city. So I think that's really exciting and very, very interesting. So that is something to take into account if you ever read about how tropical cities are low density compared to European cities. They're not taking into account where the food's coming from and how much space that takes. Now the other thing is, I love this part, humid neotropical environment. It's always interested me, and I wish I could do life over again. Actually, Edinburgh is fantastic for people who have done the ecology of the neotropics. So how does that affect Maya urbanism in Maya cities? There's no grazing animals. No grazing animals. No cattle, no sheep, no goats. No pasture. No dedication to cutting down the trees so you can plant pasture for cows. They built an urbanism without a grazing animal complex. I think that's really important, especially today when we are trying to cut down on carbon emissions and and the idea that grazing animals when they are when the agriculture reaches such huge scales. So I'm not talking about small scale farmers or anything like that, but the extent to which modern society now depends on grazing animals is staggering, and it's not great for the environment. And the fact that we have a civilization that built cities and they managed without a grazing animal complex, I think is really important. So their subsistence was focused on small-bodied mammals, deer, fowl, fish, insects, vegetables, and tree crops. So the implication is the absence of grazing animals had implications for how the land was managed, right? Tree crops take on an added importance, as do resources from trees. Forests are preserved. I have here no metal tools and no orcs. I just loved Lord of the Rings when the trees got back at the orcs, but in the early, I don't know if it was the first film or the second, when the orcs are making all their tools, their metal tools, they have to cut down thousands of trees, right, for the fuel to produce the metal. And we'll see, the Maya did have metal, but they didn't produce weapons or things like that. So they weren't using up the forest resources, and probably they wouldn't because they depended on plant and forest resources more than we do. So I thought I would just go through some of the subsistence of the Maya, the animals and the plants, so that you would be more familiar with what I'm talking about, that there can exist an urbanism that's not dependent on grazing animals. And these are some of the small-bodied mammals. In Belize we call this a gibna and a bush rabbit, but I think one is an agouti and one is a paca. And this is a little, they call it an antelope, but it's a little kind of deer, so cute. This is white-tailed deer, armadillo. Turkey was domesticated. Okay, turkey was domesticated. Muscovy duck was domesticated. Pigs were not, although I know people who have kept pigs as pets, the wild pigs. They can be quite docile, and they can be killers as well. Turtles, lots and lots and lots of turtles. At Lamanai, that was a big part of the diet, was turtles and river fish, but lots of turtles. And other kinds of wild birds. Fish was also a major part of the diet. This happens to be a red snapper from the sea. Inland people used more riverine fish, but they did import, it's interesting, many of the inland sites actually imported marine fish. And the bee, there was a honey bee, a stingless bee, that produced honey. I mentioned already that corn, beans, and maize were really important crops. I mentioned it's called nixtamalization, and this is the woman has soaked the corn in lime, heated it, and then is grinding the kernels into. Well, you could make it into the flour, but as you know, you could either do tortillas on the bottom or tamales on the top. Tomatoes now are from the neotropics, and I think that they're from the Maya. When I say Maya area, because some Amazonians have been able to propose that some of these neotropical crops were domesticated there rather than farther north. So some things we don't know, but I believe the tomatoes are from the Maya area. Varieties of chili peppers, okay? Cassava, are you familiar with cassava or manioc? There are two kinds. One you can boil, which we find in London a lot. The other is poisonous, but has cyanide in it, but that's what makes this really delicious cassava bread. And to process it, you have to grate the cassava, stick it in a cassava squeezer, which is what this is, hang it from a tree, and you squeeze and squeeze and squeeze the cassava, and it gets rid of the cyanide, and it makes a really delicious bread that preserves way better than maize bread, than corn. Cocoa is a bit like our potato. It's very close to our potato, which is probably why it hasn't become as popular. Yams, which I think here you call sweet potatoes for Christmas, right? And there is a white potato that in the neotropics we call a sweet potato. And it is like the Irish potato, but it's sweet and it makes great desserts. And we can get it in London. You probably could get it in Edinburgh, I would think. Amaranth, I love amaranth. It makes it's like spinach, but better. Quinopodium, which is quinoa, right? And I don't know if any of you have Mesa Sunrise. It's the best quinoa cereal. We'll try it. It's really good. Soteria, which was a grass that was used before maize was domesticated. And once maize became widely used, Soteria kind of dropped off the map. And north of Yucatan, they also have maguey, which you probably know. Well, it was a basis of the hemp industry for a while. But these days, it's probably better known for producing tequila. This is not a tobacco, one of the major domesticates. In fact, the first domesticates that went from the New World to the Old were tobacco and chili. Chayote is a very mild vegetable that you have to cook. It's really, really good. Cotton you don't eat, but I had to mention it because it was a domesticate of this part of the world, and it has since, of course, it's long staple cotton. So this is what is grown in Egypt now. And in Peru, and highly desirable because of the long staple. So it's a little bit different from Indian cotton, which has a short staple and creates a different fabric. So when the New World cotton was discovered, it spread, and I think that's what made the money, and not gold. It was textiles. There's palms, there's bottle gourds, avocado comes from that area, cashews come from the neotropics. Ramon nuts, the flour from Ramon you do see in some of the health food stores, but I wouldn't say it's really widespread. Cashews are also, the fruit is also poisonous. Did you know it's related? Oh, it's related to poison ivy, which you don't have here. Vanilla. Vanilla is from the neotropics. What a wonderful, wonderful flavor to have. And this is the most important. Right? Chocolate. What would we do without chocolate? Now, I'd like to say it was domesticated in the Maya area, and we thought for a while, but now recently in the Amazon, they found an earlier form of cacao, but who cares? It's from that area, and it's the best thing to happen to the world. These are almost all my pictures except for one, and it's so weird. Look, have you ever seen cacao? The pods grow right out of a tree. It looks like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Have you ever seen that film? Oh, it looks like cacao pods. They're weird. When you see them, you think, am I really, am I here, or is this an alien? But that's how it grows. Probably mommy, I included that because it's my favorite color, but I don't think you see too much mommy apple here in Britain. But we do see papaya, and that is a domesticate of the Maya area. Guanabana is now pretty much mostly produced for the world market in India, but it is a wonderful flavor. I don't know if you've ever had it. My son was in the cocktail business for a while, and he made cocktails with it. It's great with gin. Not so much with rum, but gin. It has a beautiful sort of sweetness and tartness. It's just great. It makes great ice cream, too. That's what I'm going to do in my retirement. I'm going to make soursop ice cream. Allspice, it's from the Maya area. Chicle, chewing gum, although I included airwaves here because I read an article about a month ago that all of our chewing gum is plastic. It's an awful thought, isn't it? I wish we could go back to chicle, which is the sap of a tree. It's pretty much, like maple syrup, too. You tap the tree, it doesn't die, so you can go back. And I don't know why, really, yes, I know why it's replaced. It's cheaper. I guess plastic is a petroleum product. Chicle, you have to actually hire people to climb trees and get the sap. Rubber is also from this part of the world, and the British have a close relationship with rubber because they were not able to capitalize on the industry in the New World because the rubber tree, like mahogany, like some of the other neotropical trees, it needs a mother tree and it has to grow in the forest. It doesn't adapt to a plantation. But the British brought rubber trees to Burma, and they somehow managed there to develop plantations of rubber. This is one of the things that I'm really very interested in, as to how that happened, and does it have to do with insect pests or something in the New World that they don't have in the Old? But I don't know how much is made from real rubber today either. So I just wanted to give you that survey of plants and animals that come out of the Neotropics in the Maya area. So I like to think of them as guidelines for a largely plant-based diet and a viable agro-urbanism. But this idea of the Maya being able to tell us something about soil connectivity really interests me. The concept was introduced by a soil scientist, Alex McBratney, and it's one of 5 criteria to improve soil-people relationships in urban environments. The other 4 tend to be top-down, which soil connectivity means, how do we get people to care about soil in cities? And these plans that I've showed you of Maya cities suggest strongly that access to unpaved green space was carefully managed and maintained as part of the city agro-urban landscape. On the left, you have those terraces at Caracol that I told you about. On the right, my colleague Ben Wies, who I've been working with a lot in recent years, he worked at a site called Chunchuk Mil. But this is actually a survey done by, I think it was Aline Magnoni, and she mapped here gardens, walled gardens in the city of all throughout the city of Chunchuk Mil. So we're taking the hypothesis that Maya urbanism promotes soil connectivity and trying to see how we can apply it to cities today. Because in urban communities, as my colleague Ben says, as more land is required to house more people, you also need more land to sustain more people. And given the extensive soil sealing in cities, we have pavement that covers the soil, roads that cover the soil, we need a change in how urban populations engage with soils. And this concept of soil connectivity is critical to what we call soil security, which is one of my main interests, and where I have been trying to get funding for a long time. And I have for a while, but that's another story, not recently. But I have done quite a bit of work on soil in Maya cities. I mentioned my friend Ben Wies, his name is here, Benjamin Wies, and a few years ago he got funding from AHRC for what we call the Tropical Urban Life Project. And Ben and my colleague, Ben is now he's studied in the Netherlands and at Leicester, and Christian Isendals from Sweden, from Malmö. Karsten Lambers is now at Leiden. But it was Ben who got the grant with Christian for all of us. And one of the things we did first was to have these meetings with people to discuss cities and these different topics. Waste management and decay, that's my interest, my sort of symposium. Spatial practices, which is what Ben has studied for years. And food security, which is what Christian has focused on. And they were wonderful, and that's places where I met other colleagues that I was able to bring in on this project. And one of the things that resulted from Ben's network was an exhibition in 2018 at the Sainsbury Center for Visual Arts on what designers can learn from Maya cities and apply it to design in cities today. And it was quite successful. And I tried to find more pictures, but these were the most easiest. A lot of them were not very clear. But this is a Dutch group who designed these residences with, as you can see, soil. Well, they called it soil and water rehabilitation around the structures. And it's another Dutch group who designed housing in an attempt to integrate housing with the green environment. They didn't. Again, you don't see too much in the way of agriculture here or growing plants, whereas you do see it here. But nonetheless, different groups made efforts to think of cities better integrated with green space than we have now. So this is one of the things that I am working on now. How can we bring about soil connectivity in urban planning? And I don't mean that you have to read this stuff. It's just to show you that, yes, I actually have published with my colleagues, and there are a couple of things that are coming out, which well, there are more that I haven't included here, about how we can learn from Maya cities about soil connectivity. But it isn't easy, you know, it's not easy because, as I mentioned to you, and I started to read about efforts here in Britain to have garden cities, the original plans were much more ambitious, and then as time went on and the cities were designed, the horticulture and the, you know, growing things didn't happen. Green spaces, yes, but the growing thing was not integrated into the city itself. So that's pretty much it. My green cities, my garden cities. So I'd be interested in your comments about this.